Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Lewis Cran, family medicine physician. And in today's video, I'm going to go through some of the recent changes that the CDC has made to the timing of the COVID-19 booster dose, as well as try to explain the changes to the isolation and quarantine guidelines that the CDC recently made. Now, based on the questions that I'm getting from my patients, as well as the comments that I'm seeing online, there appears to still be a lot of confusion around some of these changes, in particular the isolation and quarantine guidelines. So I'm going to try to simplify them as best I can. All right, let's get started. Okay, so let's start with the changes to the timing of the booster dose, because I think that's the most straightforward and the least controversial, frankly. So if you got Pfizer or Moderna as your initial vaccine series, you can now get the booster dose 5 months after your second dose. And it applies both if you got Pfizer and Moderna. Initially, there was a recommendation to stick with 6 months between the second dose and the booster dose of Moderna, but that has now been changed to align with the Pfizer vaccine to recommend it at 5 months. Now, this does not apply to anyone age 5 to 11 because that group has not been authorized to get a booster dose as of yet. Now, that may change in the future, but right now, booster doses are only authorized in the United States for those 12 and up. Now, if you got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine as your initial vaccine, then it is recommended that you get your booster dose 2 months after you got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And you can get any of the 3 authorized vaccines in the United States as your booster dose. Personally, I recommend my patients get either Pfizer or Moderna because unfortunately the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is not working as well as we would have hoped. It is the least effective of the 3 vaccines. So just a quick summary. If you got Pfizer or Moderna, 5 months after your second dose, you can get the booster shot if you're eligible for a booster. Johnson & Johnson, it's 2 months. Okay, now let's move on to the changes to the isolation and quarantine guidelines because frankly, I think those are a little bit more confusing and definitely a little bit more controversial. So let's start with quarantine. Now, quarantining applies to somebody who has been exposed to an individual who is known positive for COVID-19. Now, exposure is defined as being within 6 feet of someone who is positive for COVID-19 for a cumulative total of 15 minutes. So it's not just if you're around somebody for a single 15-minute time frame, but it actually applies to a cumulative total of 15 minutes. So if you're around somebody kind of intermittently throughout the day, but it totals more than 15 minutes in a 24-hour period, then you are considered exposed. Okay, so what does the CDC say recently about somebody who is exposed? If you are vaccinated, meaning you've gotten at least the first 2 doses of Pfizer or Moderna or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, you actually do not need to quarantine at all unless you start to show symptoms. If you start to show symptoms consistent with COVID-19, then you need to get tested right away. If you are unvaccinated, you need to quarantine, which means staying away from other individuals. And if you do need to be around others, at least wear a mask. But this is preferably staying at home and trying to avoid contact with anyone who's not been exposed for 5 days. On day 5, it's recommended that you get a test. If you test negative for COVID-19, then you are allowed to leave quarantine, providing that you stay masked anytime you are within 6 feet of another individual. During the next 5 days, you should continue to remain masked, and of course, if you show any symptoms during any of the initial 10 days since you were exposed, get tested right away. So let me recap that. 5 days after exposure, stay home and stay away from others. Get tested on day 5. If you're negative, then you may leave quarantine, but you should remain masked anytime you're around somebody else for the next 5 days. So that's a total of 10 days of kind of remaining vigilant and trying to stay away from others. Just in case you become positive, you don't want to expose somebody else unknowingly. Now, what if you are actually positive for COVID-19? What do the new guidelines say about isolating? The new guidelines recommend isolating for 5 days, and as long as you are fever-free without a fever-reducing medication and your symptoms are improving, then you may leave isolation, providing that you wear a mask anytime you're around anybody else. Now, I recommend that you also minimize your exposure to others and only leave isolation when it's absolutely necessary. Because unfortunately, even though you're now being allowed to leave on day 5, that doesn't mean that you're not still contagious. We know that many individuals are still contagious after day 5. That's why it's extremely important to wear a mask properly, covering the nose and the mouth, anytime you're going to be close to another individual who's not also positive with COVID-19. For the next 5 days, you should continue to wear that mask and minimize your exposures as much as you can. In general, your infectiousness will decrease slowly over those next several days. So you want to try to avoid exposing as many people as you can, both by minimizing your contacts as well as wearing a properly fitted mask. So unfortunately, the CDC shortening these guidelines, I think, has led to a lot of individuals feeling like they're not still contagious after day 5 and becoming a little bit, shall we say, loosey-goosey with minimizing their contacts and actually wearing that mask. So it is still important that you try to minimize the spread of this virus because unfortunately, especially with Omicron out there right now, which is extremely infectious anyways, the more people you come in contact with, even after day 5, the more likely you are to spread it to somebody, and we just keep fueling this fire. And I know we're all ready to get out of this as quickly as we can. So the more that we can do what's right and try to limit the spread, the quicker we can be done with this. Quick summary on this one. If you're sick with COVID, 5 days isolating, that means staying away from others who aren't sick, isolating at home. And then as long as you're fever-free without medication and feeling better, you don't have to be completely symptom-free, but you need to be feeling better, then you can leave isolation, minimize your contacts with others, and wear a mask anytime you need to be around anybody else for an additional 5 days. So you still have a total of 10 days of trying to minimize your exposure to others. Just with everybody getting sick, we can't exactly have the economy shutting down and nobody out there working because the sheer numbers of people who are getting sick right now would cripple the economy. So I understand why from an economic standpoint, the CDC made the changes to the isolation guidelines. But we still need to do everything we can to try to minimize the spread of this virus, even if you need to leave isolation and get back to work. Okay, so I hope that helps simplify some of the changes that the CDC has made. If you have any questions about the guidelines that weren't real clear in this video, or if you have any additional questions, please leave me some comments down below, and I'll be happy to answer them as best I can. And as always, be safe out there.